Hey!
Good morning, everyone.
Hello, everybody.
I'm Mark Whitaker, and it is my great pleasure and honor to be in discussion this morning with Abby Phillip, who you know as the anchor of CNN Newsnight with Abby Phillip. Previously, she was a reporter at The Washington Post and at Politico, but now she's an author.
On top of my other jobs, right?
And of this great new, it's not, we were talking about it backstage, it's not really a biography of Jesse Jackson, although you'll learn a lot if you read it about his upbringing and so forth, but how he came to run for president in 1984 and 1988. And how those two runs both changed the discussion at that point, helped lead to the election 20 years later of our first black president, but also how they resonate with the politics and debates of today. But so as you would say on CNN, let's start with breaking news. Reverend Jackson was admitted to the hospital this week. Can you tell us how he's doing?
Yeah, so I'm sure you've seen he was hospitalized this week in Chicago. He has had what they believed for about 10 years was Parkinson's disease, but now slightly different diagnosis. He has something called supranuclear palsy. And so at 84 years old, he just had a birthday. He is grappling with this illness. He has been responding to treatment, but of course his family recognizes that given his diagnosis and his age, they're just asking for prayers at this point. But he's been, I would say, in and out of the hospital these last few months, and the colder weather, I think, has not helped. But yeah, I mean, I think at this moment he's stable, but still hospitalized in Chicago.
So I just want to remind everybody that we're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have time for your questions. So if you want to ask a question, you can submit it to online or with your phone, or using the code up there, to texastribune.org/ask. Okay, so you interviewed him multiple times for this book, and he was already suffering from some of the symptoms. I've got to say, it's really kind of tragic because, it's sort of like Muhammad Ali. I mean, Jesse Jackson is one of the greatest talkers of all time.
Yes, yeah.
Is now in a position where he can't do that, but he was able to talk. And when you first met with him, so what were your impressions of him, and was he different in person and at that stage in his life than the public image we all remember?
Very different, I mean, I think if you do have a public image of him from his heyday in, I would say the 70s and the 80s were probably the sort of the heights of his popular power. I mean, he was tall, handsome, a former athlete, and a really prolific speaker, and somebody who loved being in the public eye, loved talking to people. By the time I was sitting down with him, this was around 2020, 2021, he was about 5 or so years into this diagnosis. So he was sort of midway through, and already it was starting to compromise his ability to move around, to walk, his stamina, and his ability to speak. And, Reverend Jackson has always had this accent, right? This kind of Southern drawl of an accent. And he's always been a little bit tough for some people to understand. But by this point, it was very difficult. So I knew as I was talking to him, especially in our first interview, I'd spoken to him briefly on the phone, and I said to him, I was like, Reverend Jackson, I'd like to interview you for this book, and I said, but I really need to come to Chicago and do it in person, because I knew that you cannot conduct a phone interview with him of this kind of scope. So I knew that it had to be in person. There was also the COVID-19 pandemic happening at the same time. So there were all these layers of kind of challenges around just kind of getting in front of this. He was just about 80 years old at the time, this 80-year-old man. And when I showed up at the Rainbow Push Coalition in Chicago, he was there in the lobby. I walked in, he was in the lobby, and there were people there, and he was taking pictures, and he calls me over, literally just seconds after I walk in, calls me over, drags me into a photo line, and I'm wearing this like N95 mask, and he's wearing a surgical mask, but it's like on his chin. and I was like, okay, so I guess he's not that worried about COVID. But we were able to do the interview. We were able to do about an hour before it became clear that he needed a break. He needed to stop, take his medication, and get some rest. And so, my opportunities to interview him were not like what you would, as a journalist, I know, Mark, you know this, like sometimes when you're doing these kinds of in-depth stories, you want to spend 2 hours with someone. You want to be able to spend days with them. But his illness didn't really make that possible. So we had to do it over the course of many months. And actually it turned out to be several years of talking to him on the phone for minutes at a time, or in person, or I went to his hometown of Greenville, South Carolina with him, and so trying to just get as much as I could out of shorter bursts of time with him. So
let's back up a little bit. So most of the events that you write about in this book happened before you were born.
Yes. I was a twinkle in my mother's eye, as they say.
Abby was born in the fall of 1988, which was after Jesse Jackson's second run for president, and his second great speech at the convention that year, and well after the civil rights activism in association with Dr. King that we all remember. So what made someone of your generation want to go back and write about Jesse Jackson?
I think it is actually exactly for that reason, because I felt like I was coming to the subject a little cold, with not as much of a preconceived idea of what it should be. And I also felt like for my generation, this was something that felt worthwhile to do, because there were a lot of people my age and younger who were, for the first time, engaging with the political system through people like Bernie Sanders or even Donald Trump. And one of the big questions that is asked by this book is, to what do both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump owe Jesse Jackson? And I think that there is so much in our modern day politics that harkens back to this era that, that shows that someone like Bernie, who I spoke to for the book, Senator Sanders said to me that my campaigns picked up where Jesse Jackson's left off. And I think that there is a whole generation of Americans who doesn't know anything about that. Some of them may not even know that Jesse Jackson had ever even run for president. I think many people know that Jesse Jackson is this civil rights figure, and he seems sort of ever present in our society. He shows up when there's something going on. But they don't know that there was a time when he was one of the most admired and well-known Black Americans in the entire country. He was a sort of super celebrity at that time. He was just kind of an object of fascination and, in some cases, ridicule for the people who didn't like him. He was very polarizing in that way. And he was a kind of, dare I say, Trumpian figure before Trump. He had the celebrity. He did not have the political experience. And even in spite of that, ran these sort of insurgent campaigns for the presidency that were about not more than just his race and his Blackness. They were also about a sort of brand of economic populism that we are seeing come back into being. And so both as a political journalist and as a person who was younger, this felt like an important chapter to really drill down on and better understand, especially with the passage of time, because I think the passage of time has been necessary, I think, to fully understand what the lasting impact of these campaigns was.
So I want to get back to that later, and I'm sure some of you will have questions about, how his campaigns and what he stood for speaks to today. But so you begin the book with a few biographical chapters. So just in terms of figuring out in your own mind what made him tick, there were two things that I learned that I thought were fascinating. One was he was not raised by his biological father, but that his biological father still loomed very large in his sense of himself. And the other, because we're in Texas, we got to talk about football. And he was a high school and college quarterback. Yeah. And you also make the case that to understand who he became, you have to look at that as well. So talk more about both those things.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with what I like to call the daddy issues, which is common among people who run for president, men in particular. There's a theme here. He is someone who, first of all, never shied away from that fact. When I went to Greenville with him, the first place he stopped, we stopped he was in the car driving around town, and we pulled up to the house where he was born. And it's this little 3-room house. You have to take these steep stairs to go up, and it's sitting there, and it's kind of more or less the way that it was when he was born in it. But just a stone's throw away is the house next door. And that's where his birth father used to live. And when his teen mom gave birth to him in that house, no one knew that she had been impregnated by her neighbor, an older Black man, well-to-do, in Black society in Greenville. Eventually, Noah Robinson moved away, and they moved to another side of town, and they had a nicer house and all of that. But Jesse Jackson grew up, as he said in his 1988 convention speech, he was called Jesse Burns. That was his grandmother's last name. He became Jesse Burns and then Jesse Jackson. Jackson was his stepfather's name. And he would say, relaying this in his speeches, that he was born without a name. And I think that fact for him of not knowing his birth father, but also then learning the sense of rejection, that this man was literally right next door and didn't claim him until he was much older, it has always stuck with him. And I think it is part of the drive that he's had since he was very young to prove the naysayers wrong. And it was that drive added with just the fact that he was gifted. He had a few skills, but one of them was athletic ability. He was an athlete. He was a star quarterback. He was 6'3". He sort of had the physique. And on the football field, he was sort of mentored by his coaches. He learned leadership ability. He learned how to speak. He learned how to speak with authority. He said he learned how to lead in the middle of chaos. And the combination of those two things have always been part of his psychological DNA as a man, as a leader, but also as someone who always had this insatiable yearning. That yearning, that desire for belonging, that desire for a father figure, that's what led him to Dr. King. That's what led him to always want to achieve something. You know, people who run for president, they have this desire for like this brass ring. And I don't know that Jesse Jackson, he was not the type, as far as I could tell, who, you know, when he was like 20 or whatever, he was like, I want to be president. I don't think it was that. But at some point, he discovered in his own mind that I have what they have. He was in close proximity to Nixon and to Jimmy Carter and then to Ronald Reagan. And every single one of those interactions, he would come away with thinking, wait a second, what do they have that I don't have? And so suddenly, I think the presidency started to become that brass ring for him, a way for him to prove his worth to a world that I think he always never thought he was worth anything.
So America first got to know Jesse Jackson, as you said, as an aide to Dr. King. He was still in his 20s. There's the famous photograph of him the day before King's assassination on the balcony with Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy of the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, where he was killed the next day. Yet, as you remind us in the book, his behavior around the assassination made him immediately controversial within the movement. So tell that story.
It made him immediately famous and immediately controversial at exactly the same time. So he was there on that day that Dr. King was assassinated. You know, just moments before the shots rang out, he was not actually on the balcony next to King. There is a famous photo of him.
The day before.
Yeah, the day before. He and King were standing on the balcony and they're pointing at something. And it seems as if they are pointing, it's a photo that almost suggests that they're pointing at where the shots came from. That's not what that photo shows. That was the day before. The day of, he was down in the courtyard. And Dr. King was on the balcony, and he was calling up to Dr. King, and they were joking about going to a dinner later that night. The shots ring out, and he and others race up the stairs to try to help him. The problem, though, was that Dr. King was rushed to the hospital where he later died. Jesse Jackson was not holding him, cradling his head. There were a lot of these narratives that came out of that moment that he didn't squash. He didn't say, no, I wasn't there, I wasn't holding him. But he did show up the very next day in Chicago with a shirt that was soaked in Dr. King's blood. And he told everyone, this is Dr. King's blood, and he wore it for days. I can't overemphasize how angry that made people in Dr. King's circle. I mean, in a lot of ways, the scene of Dr. King's death is sort of like the Last Supper, almost, with, Jesus and his disciples. You have all these men around Dr. King who have been following him, who've been there for all these moments, and in that moment, he's gone, and they're left sort of grappling with their emotions, their anger, their pain. And as they're doing that in Memphis, someone isn't there, and that someone is Jesse Jackson. They wake up the next morning, and Jesse Jackson is in Chicago on television. He's literally on the Today Show. And I think they felt betrayed because they had agreed not to speak to the press. And also, they felt like he was using this shirt as a way of suggesting that he had been closer to the moment that he actually was. And a lot has been said about this and written about this over the years. And, some of the people around Dr. King, they would say, The only way that he could have gotten blood on his shirt was that he went up to the balcony and scooped it up and smeared it on his shirt. And that idea was so reprehensible to many of them that it created a rift that in some cases never healed. In some cases, they were able to put it to the side publicly, but there was always a private distrust of him among those people and with the family. And Jesse Jackson, in explaining this, he doesn't really explain it. He just says, I was in pain. I was in profound pain. And I think both things can be true. I think he acted callously, and he was also acting out of profound emotional instability, just like the rest of them were. And the one thing that I think is valuable for me in writing about this as I was doing that was just remembering how young he was. He was like 26 years old when this was happening. He was the youngest person in Dr. King's circle at that moment. And he was always kind of seen as the impetuous one, the one who was kind of a little too big for his britches. You know, he would come and ask Dr. King to have a speaking slot at his events. But that youth, but that hard-charging nature, I think, is what separated him from the other people in Dr. King's circle. It led to him doing things that were totally ill-advised. And I think it was a sign of someone who was kind of stepping into this moment of incredible public scrutiny. He suddenly became one of the most famous people in the world in that moment. But he was too young, I think, to really handle it with a sense of maturity. So, I mean, those are the circumstances. And I think that story kind of has to be told, because when you then fast forward to the 1980s and you're kind of wondering, so you've got this guy and he's maybe the most prominent black figure and he's running for president, and yet none of the people that he was in the trenches with in the late 1960s are there with him, endorsing him, supporting him, backing him up. Why? The answer is in part because of his conduct on that fateful moment in 1968.
So it basically plants, so there are all these different narratives. It's one of the fascinating things about his story. And one of the narratives is just Jesse is showboat, right? Egomaniac and so forth, and that gets established then. But as you said, he had this incredible drive. So he goes back to Chicago, which had become his base, courting the media, clashing with the daily machine there, et cetera, continues to keep himself in the public eye. And then in 1984, he decides that he's going to run for president, right? Now, this was not only an unpopular decision with the Democratic establishment at the time, the white Democratic establishment, but a lot of black folks.
Yeah,
you know,
most of them. Most black leaders, I would say.
Right.
Yeah.
So there were people instantly who said, well, this is just Jesse being Jesse, he's on another ego trip. But there was a theory of the case, right, for why it was meaningful and the effect that he could have as a black candidate at that moment. And explain what that was.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to the mayoral election in Chicago that happened really months before he decided to announce his run for president in 1983. And in that election, when Harold Washington was seeking to be the first black mayor of Chicago, Jesse Jackson, along with a lot of other figures in sort of black Chicago civil society, they came together and, frankly, at Harold Washington's urging, because he was like, I'm not going to run for mayor until you guys can do this. He said to them, you need to register, X amount of voters, I think it was like 500,000 voters or something like that, new voters, and you need to raise X amount of money. And they did it. They launched this massive voter registration drive that registered hundreds of thousands of new voters in Chicago. a lot of them black voters who had been disengaged from the political process. And Harold Washington took a city that was almost tribal in the way that it organized itself around ethnic groups and racial groups and the machine politics, and used the sort of almost universal power of the black vote. I think he got like 90% of the black vote in the primary to propel himself to winning the Democratic primary in Chicago. And the entire Democratic establishment, by the way, nationally, they had come into Chicago, they were endorsing, and they were endorsing the white candidates. And so he beat, it was seen as Harold Washington, with the power of black voters, beating the establishment. And for someone like Jesse Jackson, I mean, this is where he starts his story. When you ask Jesse Jackson, why did you decide to run for president? He says, well, it started in 1983 when we were fighting to get Harold Washington in the mayor's race. Because he saw that as just proof positive of what could happen when black voters, who were not a majority of the Democratic base, but a fraction of it, but if they moved in sync and they used their power in an almost unified way, could challenge the establishment and put a candidate, maybe it's a black candidate, but maybe it's just a candidate that has their interests in mind, on the agenda. And he saw that as a, just sort of a precursor for what could happen on the national level. I mean, it's hard to imagine that at this moment, because I think Chicago is now seen as this sort of center of black political power. But it was not that in the early 1980s. The mayorship was seen as an earthquake, nationally, for such a large American city to be led by a black man. And so there were these sort of national echoes to it. And I think that there's something that was true about that, and we've seen it maybe some decades since. I think what was true about it is that when black voters do vote in numbers, when they're registered, and when they vote, as a group, they can exert an enormous amount of power in the political system. And we did see that in Obama's run in 2008. But with Jesse Jackson, I think we saw it a bit less so, because there was much less, I think there was a lot of grassroots support, but there was much less unity for his candidacy, in part because the sort of thought leaders in the black community, the people who were the mayors and the, even people like Coretta Scott King and sort of these giants of the black community, they were torn. They did not think it was a good idea for Jesse to run for president. And so I think that created a fracture that wasn't there when Obama ran 2 decades later.
So, but he was successful enough that he became a player in the convention. And he gave the first of these two unbelievable speeches. I mean, I think, whether you agree with him or not, it's worth going back on YouTube and listening to both the 84 and the 88 speech. But again, that alone then kind of positions him to think about and then deciding to run again in 88. You pointed out something that blows my mind. So he runs again in 1988. For students of politics, that was, it was the Dukakis, George Bush Sr. race. It was not close in the end. It wasn't all that memorable. But it did produce one of the great books about modern presidential politics, a book by Richard Ben Kramer, a journalist, called What It Takes, right? And it's still, people will say this is one of the greatest books ever written about politics, even though it wasn't that close a race. And yet Jesse Jackson isn't in the book.
No.
But there was a time during that race where it looked like he might actually get the nomination after he won the caucus in Michigan. So describe that moment and then describe what I would, euphemistically or not so called the freak out that kind of happened in the party.
Because that is what it was.
Yeah.
I mean, in 1988, he was running a second time, and he had a much more organized campaign than the first time around. And he had also a theory of his strategy that was more robust, I think, even than the first time. He really started to believe that, and he was right because he did do this, but he really started to believe that he could reach a much broader swath of the electorate, especially white voters. And so he was spending a lot of time in rural Missouri and in the deep South, and he would go to Texas, and he would go to all these places, these far-flung places. And his standing with white Americans was improving in that second race. He gets to Michigan, and they kind of deploy this strategy that is, I would say, very close to a sort of Bernie Sanders-like model, which is university campuses, young voters, people who are 17, about to turn 18, who are just coming into the political system, black voters, and also more white voters than I think the establishment expected. And he comes out of the Michigan caucus, and he beats Dukakis, 2-1 in the caucus. And it was a shock, I think, even to his campaign. I think that they hoped that they would do well, but they didn't think that they would outright win. And they win, and he's not even in Michigan that night. He's in Wisconsin, and he gets off the stage, and his campaign manager tells him, and they're like, oh, suddenly he has an outright delegate lead in the race. And the sound that you hear is like the heads of every sort of Democratic operative in the country exploding. Like, they were all just like, what are we going to do? And it kind of touched off this whole spate of headlines. What does Jesse want? What is it gonna, what is it gonna take to get him out of the race? Stop Jesse, the whole thing. And even inside the campaign, they were starting to think for the first time, oh, wait, we might actually have to, think about who's going to be in the cabinet and come up with a transition. I mean, it was really the first time that even Jesse Jackson was contemplating, what if I win? But here's the rub. Talking to people in the campaign at the time, they actually think that the fact that he won outright may have been the very thing that stalled his campaign. Because at that moment, suddenly, everyone had to really think, what if he wins? And there were a lot of people who voted for him because they genuinely felt that his message needed to be elevated. They identified with it. They thought that he was the only candidate. As many voters said, if you look at the clips, a lot of these voters would say, he's the only candidate even saying anything. Because all the other candidates seemed to just be sort of talking in this political spin. But his opponents really then started to hammer him on effectively electability. His lack of experience, this idea that maybe he was a slick talker but didn't really know how to execute. I think it really drilled down to voters this improbability factor, because prior to that, he really was trying to do something very unusual. He was trying to argue that he should be president, having never held elected office in his life. And at that time, it was, unheard of, essentially. Now we kind of know that it can be done. It's been done. But at that time, it was not. And, his campaign manager said to me, Michigan really was the beginning of the end. Because in a way, if he had come in a close second, I think he actually might have gotten more momentum. But that outright win, it really forced the so-called establishment to take him seriously and to really launch a much more concerted effort to just put some roadblocks in the way of his candidacy.
So the thing as you talked about earlier, that really makes this fascinating when you go back and look at it, is also the context. So this is the Reagan era, right?
Yeah.
And I think there are a lot of historians who would say now that Reagan kind of shifted the politics in America, not just in terms of his own election, but just in demonizing government, forcing Democrats to run much more cautious campaigns in the way that they, talked about, issues of the economy and crime and et cetera, et cetera. And he was, in this full-throated way, talking about these systemic issues in a way that none of the other candidates did, right? Yeah. And so we'll talk more about that in a second. But then his heir, in many ways, who was Barack Obama, comes along 20 years later, also partly choosing Chicago as his base because of the Harold Washington model, proving that out in terms of black turnout and black support, but running and then governing in a much more cautious way.
Absolutely.
Than Jesse, was talking about in the 80s. So talk about the relationship, both personal and philosophical, between Jesse Jackson and Barack Obama. Very complicated.
Yeah, it is. And I would actually start by saying, as you alluded to, that their politics are not that similar. Obama was a much more centrist figure, and at least how he governed. Now, you could argue about what his sort of true political instincts are in terms of, he believed in universal health care, which was, by the way, an idea that Jesse Jackson, really first put on the national agenda. But he was also a political pragmatist and governed that way. And in many ways, some of the rift it starts there. It starts in the fact that Obama was a politician where Jesse Jackson thought of himself as a movement leader. And he was not much of a political pragmatist at all, to a fault. In fact, had he made some, frankly, more political expedient decisions in both of the campaigns, he might have actually done a little bit better. And so I think there was a lot of resentment on Reverend Jackson's part toward Obama, because
he was caught on a hot mic moment.
The famous hot mic moment saying, "Oh, he talks down to black people. I'm gonna cut his nuts off," or something like that.
An anatomical reference.
Yeah. So, what was that about? Well, that was about this idea that Obama was effectively triangulating in a way that I think Jesse Jackson didn't identify with. That he was using. He was pandering too much to the fear of white America in sort of policing black behavior, in talking down to black people. And I will say, because I was talking to someone and doing an interview on Black Radio the other day, and the host was like, a lot of people thought that was true. A lot of people still think that's true. I think there is about Obama. In the black community, there is a sense that Obama had a way of always reprimanding the community in a way.
He did that in the last campaign with Kamala, like telling black men,
Yeah. And so, some of it is ego, right? I think Reverend Jackson wanted Obama to treat him like the person who paved the way for him. He also thought that the way that Obama was carrying out the politics of the campaign was too sort of overtly political at the expense of black Americans. I think there was maybe a little bit of jealousy there too, that Obama was doing more effectively something that he had first attempted to do, which is to make that pivot between unifying the black vote and using that as a sort of strong foundation for his run, while also reaching out to white America and calming their nerves and getting them comfortable with his candidacy. It was all of the things. And, you also have to remember that these men, it wasn't just in the context of this campaign that they knew each other. I mean, they're both from Chicago. So Obama used to go to Operation Push, the Rainbow Push Coalition, for the Saturday morning meetings, and he would speak from time to time.
Wasn't Jesse's Reverend Jackson's daughter a bridesmaid
maid
for
of
Michelle?
honor.
For Michelle,
Santita Jackson was Michelle Obama's maid of honor in their wedding. Jesse Jackson Jr. was actually a close friend. Even before the campaigns, he was the co-chair of the 2008 campaign. And so when the hot mic moment happened, Jesse Jackson Jr. had to put out a statement reprimanding his own father for the hot mic moment. So if the families had these close ties, but the father, he's a man who has a lot of sort of needs for sort of self-assurance that he wasn't getting from Obama. Because at one point, and Mark, I know you know this well, but Obama had to make a pivot after the primary. And in that pivot came the Reverend Wright moment. It came all of these very high-profile moments where he had to, in many ways, keep a Jesse Jackson figure at arm's length. And Jesse Jackson didn't like that very much. So it caused a rift, and that rift, frankly, I mean, it only grew larger once Obama became president, and Jesse wanted more, and he got nothing, and it just, it was not great.
One more question before this, but I was telling Abby backstage that I was actually at CNN in a management role in 2012. So I think we all remember in 2008, Jesse got a lot of attention. He was, in Grant Park on the night of Obama's election, weeping, and cameras going to him and getting lots of interviews about what it meant to him. By 2012, he was wandering around the CNN complex in Atlanta, where the election night coverage was being broadcast, just looking for somebody to put him on air.
Yeah.
It was very poignant. Okay, so one more question before we go to the audience, which is, in your role as a CNN anchor, you preside today over all these debates about where does the Democratic Party go now? How do you, for those who are upset about the direction of the country under President Trump, and to this day, there's one school of thought that says if Democrats want to get back into power, they've got to go back to the center. They've got to, appeal to conservative Democrats, moderate Republicans, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's another school that says we have to excite voters, because the thing about American voters, the American electorate is like the number of people who don't vote, right? So rather than focusing on moving to the center, we should be taking strong, bold positions that will increase enthusiasm and turnout among voters of color, younger voters who might otherwise stay disengaged. How has writing this book and studying his Reverend Jackson's legacy made you view that debate which takes place on your air all the time?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say that this sort of, do we pivot to the center, or do we go to the corners of the left or even the right or whatever, that is an age-old debate in politics. And it was happening, as you pointed out, especially in the Reagan era, because he had touched off this realignment that was happening in America. But when you go back and you look at those races, what you will notice is that tacking to the center also did not work for Democrats. Jesse Jackson didn't win, but tacking to the center also really didn't work. To the point that Dukakis was spectacularly defeated in 1988. And I think part of the question is asking why. And I think it's helpful to, for just a moment, put aside a sort of left, right, center paradigm for looking at our politics. And simply ask the question, what is the mood of the country, both in the 80s and today? And I think that there is no question that there is a deep anti-establishment, populist mood driven in large part by economic discontent that is driving the politics on both the left and the right. And so in that context, I think it is not that helpful to say, should Democrats be more to the left or should they be more to the center? The real question is, are they putting candidates and policies on the table that is responsive to that mood? And I think that part of the problem for Democrats is that when they get beaten from the right, as they did in 2016 and 2024, a lot of times they're like, well, it's because the radicals are pulling us too far to the left. But it also could be that maybe the candidates didn't properly respond to what voters were asking for, which is somebody that addresses their core economic needs. And I think when we hear the word economic, I think people think it's like all about money. It's all about dollars and cents, and it is about money, don't get me wrong. But economics is a proxy for how people feel about themselves, their families, their lives, and their futures. And so when you make people feel like they have a sense of hope, that the system is working for them, that when they go out and they earn $1, that dollar means something, that is not just speaking to the money that is in their bank accounts. It's also speaking to what they see for their future, for their kids' futures. And so that is why it does all come down to the economy, stupid, as, as was famously said. Because that is really that's what it's about, is actually people's sense of themselves. And I do think that, there is a cautionary tale in being so deeply enmeshed in the mushy middle that voters cannot tell the difference between you and another candidate with another letter next to their name, R or D. And that is the risk that I think Democrats face. It's the mistake that they often make, because I think there's too much of an obsession with right and left, and less of a focus on what is the actual message, and is it actually resonating with what people want to hear. And I think that this anti-establishment mood that drove a Jesse Jackson, that helped power a Bernie Sanders, that frankly drove a Zohran Mamdani and a Donald Trump, that is one of the most powerful forces in our politics today. When I go back often and I listen to and I read Jesse Jackson's '84 speech that you mentioned. And I would urge you to do that, because when you read how he talks about the economic vision that he had for the country, but also how he described what was going on in the country in the 1980s. He talked about factory workers who were seeing their jobs shipped overseas. He talked about an economy in which the American sort of breadbasket, the people who were feeding the country, were not being taken care of. He talked about a lot of the very same issues that Trump attacks from the right and has had a lot of political success with. And in many ways, Trump is a product of the 80s too. In the 80s, he was yelling and screaming about globalization, and he was complaining about trade. And back in the 80s, you were probably more likely to find, labor Democrats talking about those same issues too. But the party has shifted since then, and that shift has been very significant. And I don't know what the answer is for Democrats. I don't know if the answer is, okay, Democrats need to go back to protectionism. I'm not sure that it's that. But they do need to recognize that there is something real underneath that in both what Trump is doing and what Mamdani is doing. And addressing that is going to be what needs to happen as they figure out the path forward.
Let's hear some of your questions for Abby.
Thank you both for that. I'm Eleanor Klibanoff, the law and politics reporter at the Texas Tribune. Molly Smith from Austin asks, with the depths of changes that Jesse Jackson made economically, politically, with community building, why is he so rarely referenced in our current political discourse?
It's a great question. I think, honestly, some of it has to do with the fact that he seems a little too ubiquitous in a way. He's kind of ever-present. I think people feel like they know a lot about Jesse Jackson and maybe don't need to know anymore. And that's fair. I was saying to Mark backstage that one of the things that becomes very apparent when you write about him is that he's a bit of a victim of his own success and his own longevity. That he's had so many chapters in his life that I think people have a hard time picking out what's important and what's significant. And I think he is, you have to acknowledge, a very polarizing figure, that some people really don't like him, including, even in the Black community. And so that is part of the reality of who Jesse Jackson is. And I think also it's why it is valuable to do what I've tried to do in this book, which is to take a chapter and to scrutinize it on its own merits. And just ask the question, not do you like him, do you not like him, is he a hero, is he not a hero, but is he consequential? And I think that you can't really look at this period and say that he wasn't, because there really would not have been an Obama. And there may not have been a Bernie Sanders. I don't think that you would even know the Democratic Party as it is today as this truly sort of multi-racial, multi-ethnic coalition had it not been for what Jesse Jackson did, not just rhetorically, but also in terms of voter registration and creating of the foundations for coalition politics. Bringing Arab Americans into the party, bringing Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans into the party. There are deep roots that go back to Jesse Jackson. And so I think it is important to kind of look very discreetly at these chapters and strip away some of the noise of whether he's likable or not, and just ask the basic question, did it matter? And I think that it is very clear that it did.
Thank you for that. You mentioned this with Bernie Sanders, but Lisa from Austin asks whether there are other present politicians where you can see Jesse Jackson's influence on them today.
Yeah. I think a lot of them. Even, I would say, actually, I think Obama, despite their differences of politics, their way of speaking, the tradition that Obama comes out of is in the Jesse Jackson vein. A lot of people, I don't personally know him that well, but a lot of people, when I've done these talks, have mentioned James Tallarico here in Texas. One thing that I think is interesting about him is the way that he talks about faith. And I think this is a bit of a missing piece for a lot of candidates in these modern times. I think it has been, I think Democrats, in large part, they've tried to distinguish themselves from the right, and the right has been so identified with, evangelical religious politics that the left has tried to characterize itself in opposition to that. But in the process, they've lost this sense of sort of moral grounding that I think candidates like Jesse Jackson had, and that even Obama tapped into when he was running. And I think that there is something about that can be actually very resonant. That one of the things that made Jesse Jackson such a powerful speaker was not just that he used rhymes and alliteration and all of that, but also he spoke through religious texts and spoke about a moral premise for his candidacy. And I think that, it will be interesting for me to see how that resonates with voters in this country, even as the country is becoming less religious. I do think that there are many voters for whom morality still appeals to them, and candidates that speak to that, I think, can potentially do very well.
Thank you. Sylvia from Austin asks, did Jesse Jackson see himself as a potential successor to Dr. King?
Absolutely. Did he? Yeah, I mean, in the book, I interview a man named Don Rose. He's sort of a kind of titan of Chicago politics. He's like 94 or something like that, but very much still kicking. And he was a spokesperson for Dr. King in the 60s when Dr. King went to Chicago. And right after King's assassination, he was helping Jesse Jackson, Reverend Jackson, with that media tour that he did that was so controversial. And he told me that they were in the car driving to a media appearance, and Reverend Jackson asked him point blank, do you think I can step into Dr. King's shoes? And that was clearly on his mind, because he thought he was the only person who had the combination of skills and gifts in order to do it. The speaking skills, the ability to convene, the ability to organize, the ability to grab attention. Again, super controversial, because he was really not the one who was supposed to be next in line. It was Ralph Abernathy, who was Dr. King's best friend. And so those private conversations were happening, but of course, people around him knew that he had those ambitions, and they didn't like it. They thought it was presumptuous. But, I mean, in a way, he wasn't entirely wrong, because he did understand the piece of movement building that does require the ability to grab a microphone and grab attention. And that was powerful for Dr. King, and it turned out to have been powerful for Jesse Jackson. But yeah, I mean, literally the next day, he was asking that question. And that is one of the reasons that I think, it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, because Ralph Abernathy really was the successor to Dr. King, and that tension eventually culminated in Jesse Jackson leaving, the organization and breaking out on his own, and the rest is history.
Thank you. Our last question is a little bit more general about media, asking about, can you talk about how, when you think about working at CNN or other legacy media organizations, how you're thinking about competing with new media, podcasts, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, to reach young audiences and young voters?
Ooh, I think about this every day. As you can imagine, I mean, the two of us here are sort of legacy media types. And when you are in a so-called legacy media organization, I mean, it is in a lot of ways like trying to turn the Titanic, and it is hard, but the world is moving so fast around us, and people are getting information in radically different ways, and new voices are popping up, and I would say on the whole, that is a good thing. I think that reaching more people in more ways is good. It will, in the long term, be to the benefit of the media, in the same way that when I was first starting out in journalism in 2010, when I graduated from college, everybody was telling me that the newspaper was dead, that journalism was dying, that the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Boston Globe wouldn't exist. And it turned out to be wrong. it has shifted. The New York Times, for example, is stronger than it ever was, perhaps. And I think that, in a way, the internet and the changing ways that people consume information, it took a while, but it only spawned a new era of legacy media. And I think that will happen in this new era that we're in, where now it's YouTube and podcasting and social media. But I think, yeah, we gotta get on it. I mean, I think personally, it is difficult to have one foot in one door and one foot in the other. It would be much easier in some ways if you were just kind of going all in on, whatever, Substack or YouTube or whatever. But when you're in my position and you have to, anchor a nightly linear television show and also try to figure out how to engage people on these other platforms, it can be challenging. But I think for me, one of the things that I like about my show is that people see it. Most people, I would say, actually, who tell me that they see the show, they are seeing clips on social media. And I wish they would see the whole show, but I will take it. I'll take what I can get. And I think we have to figure out how to build on that engagement in order to sort of build a community around not just watching TV, but also engaging in the dialogue and the conversation that we're trying to facilitate on television every night.
Great note to end on. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Abby. And we look forward to seeing you back on air.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here.